1934, a Wall Street billionaire insults Bumpy Johnson and quietly moves $150,000 to make him disappear. 48 hours later, the offer is rejected and Harlem stays untouched. This wasn't jealousy or rage, it was strategy colliding with principle. One empire tried to purchase a man, the man refused. So how did Bumpy survive a billionaire's reach? To understand that night, we have to go back to where it truly began. The Waldorf Astoria ballroom in 1934 smelled like money trying to forget that 3 miles north, men were getting their kneecaps broken with crowbars over $20 debts. Duke Ellington played from a record player while wine from 1921 poured into crystal glasses, each one worth more than what a Harlem family spent on rent for 6 months. Chandeliers burned bright enough to blind you, throwing light across gowns that cost what a factory worker earned in a year, across faces that had never seen the inside of a tenement where rats chewed on sleeping children and landlords collected with brass knuckles and threats about what happens to people who complain too much. A photographer moved through the crowd with his camera, snapping pictures of senators and business owners and women whose jewelry could feed a neighborhood for a month. He raised the camera without thinking and caught 3 people standing together near the bar, so close their shoulders nearly touched. The camera clicked, the film caught it. And in that single picture was everything that was not supposed to exist in the same space at the same time. Bernard Whitfield, Wall Street billionaire, the kind of man who could make a single phone call and have a competitor's loans called in, their credit destroyed, their business torn apart and sold for parts before they understood what was happening. A man who had senators on his payroll and judges who owed him favors and police captains who looked the other way when his money needed certain problems to disappear quietly in the middle of the night. Helen Carlisle, editor at Vanity Fair, a woman so beautiful that men forgot they were supposed to be smart when they looked at her. So sharp that by the time they remembered she had already taken apart their arguments and exposed the weakness underneath. She moved through rooms full of powerful men and made them feel like children playing dress-up in their father's clothes. Bumpy Johnson, Harlem. That was all most people in the Waldorf would ever know or care to know about him. But the men who ran the numbers rackets, who controlled the loan sharking and the protection money and the gambling that kept poor neighborhoods running when banks refused to loan them a dime, those men knew different. Bumpy was the one Stephanie St. Clair sent when someone needed to understand that certain debts could not be ignored. When kneecaps needed breaking or throats needed opening or buildings needed to burn down with everyone still inside as an example to others who thought they could steal from Harlem and live to spend it. The photograph said what nobody in that ballroom would ever say out loud. A woman from the world of trust funds and country estates was standing next to a man from the world where people got their fingers crushed in vices for talking to police, where bodies turned up in alleys with their tongues cut out and stuffed in their pockets, where children learned to sleep through gunfire because it happened 3 times a week and you either got used to it or you went insane from fear. By morning the photograph was gone, not lost, not misplaced, burned. Someone had pulled it from the developer's dark room while the chemicals were still wet, had taken it somewhere private and lit a match and watched it curl into ash. The negative disappeared too, every trace erased except for the memory of the people who had been in that room, who had seen Bernard and Helen and Bumpy standing together like the social order had already collapsed and nobody had bothered to tell them. Helen did not ask for the photograph to be destroyed, Bumpy did not demand it. The order came from Bernard, delivered through men who understood that when Bernard Whitfield wanted something done, you did it, or you found yourself explaining to investigators why your accounting books did not match up, why there were problems that looked suspiciously like stealing, why you were about to lose everything you owned, including your freedom. Bernard made that photograph disappear, not because it embarrassed him, not because it would create scandal, but because it proved something he could not accept. His money was not enough to keep Helen away from Harlem. 72 hours before everything came apart, Bernard sat in his study on the 40th floor, looking down at Central Park where snow was starting to fall, and understood that he was in a fight he did not know how to win. He had spent 30 years learning that everything had a price, that every human being could be bought if you found the right number, that power was just a matter of having more money than whoever stood in your way. He had crushed competitors who thought they could outbid him, had ruined men who thought they could negotiate, had watched families lose their homes and their businesses and their futures because they bet against him and learned too late that Bernard Whitfield did not lose. But this time what he wanted was not stock or property or political influence. This time he wanted a woman to choose him over a man from Harlem, to stop going to jazz clubs where white people were not supposed to be, to stop asking questions about things that did not concern her, to stay in the cage he had built out of diamonds and first edition books and weekends at estates where the help knew to be invisible. And he was beginning to realize that all his money, all his connections, all the violence he could purchase with a phone call to the right people, none of it mattered if Helen simply did not care. He picked up the telephone, dialed a number that only 5 people in New York had access to, waited for the voice on the other end to answer before speaking in the flat tone of a man giving orders that would be followed because the alternative was too expensive to consider. I want to know everywhere she goes, everyone she talks to, every minute I cannot account for, and I want photographs. The voice on the other end did not ask why, did not ask if he was sure, just said, "Yes, sir," and hung up. Because that was how power worked in Bernard's world. You did not negotiate. You did not explain. You gave orders and people followed them, or they stopped being people who mattered and started being people who needed to find new jobs in cities where Bernard's reach was not quite as long. That night, Bernard poured himself scotch that cost more than a Harlem apartment and felt something he had not felt since he was young and poor and desperate. Fear. Not fear of losing money. He had more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. Not fear of losing status. His name opened doors that stayed closed for senators and judges. Fear of being seen as weak. Fear that Helen would tell someone, that word would spread through the circles that mattered, that men he did business with would know Bernard Whitfield could not control his own woman, that the billionaire who could buy and sell politicians had been beaten by a gangster from Harlem who probably did not have $5,000 to his name. Power could survive anything except being laughable. And Bernard could feel himself becoming a joke, could imagine the conversations that would happen in clubs and boardrooms, the knowing smiles when his name came up, the quiet understanding that Bernard Whitfield's money could not buy him the one thing he actually wanted. That was the kind of wound that never healed, the kind that festered and rotted until you did something drastic to prove you were still the man everyone feared. The war had started. A war between a man who thought money could purchase love and a woman who had never been for sale. And standing on the other side, though nobody had told him yet that he was part of this, was Bumpy Johnson, a man who understood that some things were worth dying for because they were the only things that proved you had lived. Bernard's penthouse looked like a museum where rich people went to prove they had taste along with money. 12 rooms filled with furniture that cost more than cars, art that required insurance policies thicker than most contracts, wine so old and rare that opening a bottle felt like committing vandalism against history. The windows showed Central Park 40 floors below, trees and paths and frozen lakes that looked peaceful if you ignored the fact that just north of that park, people were freezing to death in apartments where landlords had shut off heat because tenants were 3 weeks behind on rent they would never be able to pay. This was the world Bernard built for Helen. Not just wealth, but the kind of wealth that made you forget normal people existed. That protected you so completely from reality that you could believe the depression was something that happened to other people, people who had not been smart enough or ruthless enough to protect themselves when the economy collapsed and took everyone else down with it. He took her to dinners where senators discussed laws that would put thousands out of work while they ate steaks that cost $30. Introduced her to men who could make careers or destroy them with a single phone call. Spent weekends at his estate in Connecticut where 30 rooms sat mostly empty and a staff of 18 maintained gardens and stables, and a wine cellar that contained bottles worth more than the annual salary of everyone who worked there combined. He gave gifts like other men signed contracts, each one calculated to establish value and create obligation. A diamond bracelet that cost what 3 families could live on for a year. A first edition book so rare that only 2 other copies existed outside of university collections. A fur coat made from animals that had been hunted to near extinction because rich women decided they wanted to wear something nobody else could have. Bernard was buying Helen the same way he bought everything else, by finding the price and paying it and expecting ownership in return. She accepted it all. Wore the bracelet to parties where people drank champagne that cost more per bottle than a week's groceries. Read the books in the library that smelled like old leather and older money. Walked through the Connecticut estate in the fur coat while snow fell on gardens that required more maintenance than most people's entire homes. She played the role perfectly, said the right things to the right people, smiled at jokes that were not funny because the men telling them were too powerful to correct. But she kept one thing Bernard could not touch. Her own apartment, her own door, her own key, the ability to leave whenever she wanted. Bernard saw it, understood what it meant. She was not locked in. All the money he spent, all the gifts he gave, all the access he provided to a world most people would never even glimpse, none of it mattered if she could just walk away. He pretended not to notice because acknowledging it would mean admitting his cage had a door she controlled. And powerful men do not admit their cages have doors they cannot lock. The sound of her heels on his polished floors was like a countdown to something neither of them wanted to name. The smell of his imported tobacco mixed with her French perfume, the kind that came in crystal bottles and cost more per ounce than gold. The grandfather clock in his hallway marked time like a judge's gavel, each tick another second closer to the moment when pretending stopped being possible and someone would have to say out loud what they both already knew. Helen started going to Harlem. At first, she told herself it was work. Stories for Vanity Fair about jazz clubs and speakeasies and the cultural renaissance happening in a neighborhood that white newspapers only covered when someone got murdered in a way too dramatic to ignore. She went to places where the music was not polite, where people danced like their bodies were the only thing they owned that nobody could take away, where the air was thick with smoke and sweat and the particular energy that comes from people who know they might not survive the year but are determined to live hard while they still can. But what pulled her back was not the music or the dancing or even the stories nobody would let her publish. It was the feeling that in Harlem people were not performing, they were not pretending to be something they were not. The violence was real. Men got their throats cut in alleys over $20 gambling debts. Women got beat by husbands who drank their wages and came home angry at a world that ground them down every single day. Children learned to duck when they heard gunshots because the police would not come even if someone called. Because Harlem was allowed to bleed as long as the bleeding did not spill over into neighborhoods where white people lived and voted and mattered. She met Bumpy on a Tuesday afternoon in December in a coffee shop that served weak coffee and strong whiskey to men who needed both to get through the day. She was asking questions about the numbers racket, trying to understand how an illegal lottery could function openly while police walked past and pretended not to see it. Someone told her if she wanted real answers, she should talk to the man in the black hat sitting alone in the corner booth. The man who looked like he was reading a newspaper but was actually watching every person in the room, studying threats and exits and who might be carrying a weapon under their coat. Bumpy looked up when Helen approached. His eyes were flat and cold, the eyes of someone who had killed men and watched them die and felt nothing afterward except the need to clean the blade and make sure no witnesses survived to tell police what they had seen. He did not smile, did not offer her a seat, just waited for her to explain why a white woman from a magazine was stupid enough to walk into a coffee shop in Harlem and ask questions about an organization that murdered people for talking too much. Helen sat down without asking permission and opened her notebook like they were already having a conversation. She asked her questions in the direct style that had gotten her promoted faster than any woman in the magazine's history. The style that made men uncomfortable because it refused to acknowledge that women were supposed to be soft and obedient and grateful for whatever scraps of information men decided to share. She wanted to know who ran the numbers, who collected, who enforced the debts when people thought they could take Harlem's money and not pay it back. Bumpy studied her for 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. Then he spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried. The voice of someone who never repeated himself because people learned to listen the first time or they learned what happened to people who needed reminders. Dutch Schultz wants Harlem, thinks because we are black we will fold. He sends his boys in with bats and knives, they go to the collectors, break their fingers one at a time until they agree to work for Dutch instead of Stephanie. They find the runners, cut their throats in alleys where nobody sees, leave the bodies as messages. Dutch believes fear is how you build an empire. Helen wrote it down word for word, her pen moving across the page in quick strokes that captured everything he said. Bumpy watched her write and continued, his voice never changing, never rising or falling, just stating facts the way you might describe the weather or the price of bread. I make sure people are not hurt without reason, but when there is reason I make sure they understand it was their choice that brought them there. I break the bones that need breaking, cut the throats that need cutting, burn the buildings that need burning, and when I am done, everyone else knows what happens when you steal from Harlem. Helen stopped writing, looked up from her notebook, met his eyes and did not look away. Even though everything in his face said he was describing things he had actually done, was not exaggerating or trying to sound tough, was telling her the truth about who he was and what he did to survive in a world where survival required violence that would send most men to the electric chair if they ever got caught doing it. "Does that frighten you?" Bumpy asked. Not because he cared, because he wanted to know if she was going to run or if she was made of something harder than the other journalists who came to Harlem looking for stories they could clean up for white readers who wanted to feel cultured, without actually facing the reality of what poverty and racism and police brutality created when you mixed them together in the same neighborhood and let them boil. "Yes," Helen said, "but not the way you think." Bumpy's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of interest or recognition or respect. She was not lying, was not trying to prove how brave she was admitting the truth, that what he represented was dangerous in a way Bernard's world could never be, that his violence was real instead of theoretical, that he could die tomorrow or next week or tonight and would not be surprised when it happened. "You are with that billionaire," Bumpy said. Not a question, a statement. Because everyone in Harlem who paid attention knew that Helen Carlyle from Vanity Fair was Bernard Whitfield's woman, that she wore his jewelry and lived in his world and was supposed to stay there like a painting he owned. Beautiful and expensive and safely contained behind glass where nobody else could touch it. "I am with myself," Helen answered. "Bernard believes he owns me, he is wrong." Bumpy smiled for the first time. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who recognized another player in a game most people did not even know they were playing. The game of staying free when everyone around you wanted to put you in chains, wanted to control who you saw and where you went and what you said and who you belonged to. "Bernard Whitfield is a dangerous man to make a fool of," Bumpy said, and now there was warning in his voice. Real warning from someone who understood what powerful men did when they felt disrespected. "He will not break your fingers or cut your throat. He will destroy your career, make it so no magazine will hire you, make it so your name becomes poison, make it so you have nothing and no one and nowhere to go except back to him, begging him to take you back because you have finally learned your place." "Then he and I will have a problem," Helen said. She closed her notebook and stood up. "Because I do not have a place, I go where I want, see who I want, write what I want. And if Bernard cannot accept that, then whatever happens next is his choice, not mine." She walked out of the coffee shop into the December cold. And Bumpy watched her go. And in that moment, he understood two things. First, Helen Carlyle was not going to stop coming to Harlem no matter who told her to stay away. Second, Bernard Whitfield was eventually going to do something stupid, and when he did, people were going to get hurt. And the only question was how many bodies would stack up before it ended. Dutch Schultz walked into Harlem like he owned it. Like being white and connected meant he could take whatever he wanted from people who had nothing except the willingness to die defending it. His men came in daylight, 3 or 4 at a time, carrying baseball bats and brass knuckles, grabbing numbers runners in alleys and holding them down while someone swung the bat into kneecaps until bones shattered and screaming started. If the runner agreed to work for Dutch, the beating stopped. If he refused, they broke his fingers one at a time, starting with the pinky and working toward the thumb, letting him feel each bone snap before moving to the next one. If that still did not work, they cut his throat and left him in the alley as a message about what happened when you chose loyalty over survival. Dutch had built his empire this way, through fear so complete that people would betray their own mothers rather than risk being the next body with their throat opened and their eyes staring at nothing while rats came to feed. He had done it in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, had never failed because violence applied correctly always worked eventually. You just had to hurt people worse than they were willing to be hurt. But Harlem was different. These people had been beaten by cops who thought black skin meant you deserved whatever happened to you, had been cheated by landlords who charged double and called police if you complained, had watched their children starve while white neighborhoods threw away more food than Harlem ate in a week. They had nothing left to lose except dignity. And dignity was the one thing Dutch could not break with a bat or a knife. Stephanie St. Clair ran the numbers in Harlem, and when Dutch's men started breaking her runners, she chose guerrilla tactics: hit fast, hit hard, disappear before retaliation. The person she put in charge was Bumpy Johnson because Bumpy understood that in Harlem you did not need to be strongest. You just needed to make the other side decide the cost was too high. Bumpy spread a map across a basement table that smelled of mildew and cheap whiskey. He marked routes Dutch's men took, corners where they stopped to threaten shopkeepers, bars where they drank after breaking bones all day. He studied patterns like a hunter studies tracks, learning where they felt safe, where they got careless, where they could be caught alone and dealt with before anyone knew what happened. "We do not fight them where they are strong," Bumpy told the 6 men around the table, men who had all killed before. "We cut their information first, the people who tell them which runners to hit, the people who watch corners and report back. We make them blind before we make them bleed. Attack the infrastructure before the soldiers. Make Dutch's men walk through Harlem not knowing who was watching, who was waiting in the next alley with a knife or a brick that would crack their skull open." Intelligence was more valuable than violence when outnumbered, because intelligence told you where violence hurt the most. Second principle was timing. Dutch's men came during daylight because they wanted to be seen, wanted fear to spread through visible cruelty. But visibility worked both ways. A white man in Harlem during daylight stood out like a bloodstain on snow. You could follow him until he separated from his group, corner him where witnesses would never talk to police. "We hit them in daylight," Bumpy said. "When they think they are safe because the sun is up, we make them understand daylight does not protect them here." Third was survival, always 2 exits, never enter a building without knowing how to escape if things went wrong. Dutch's men had backup and cops who looked away. Bumpy's men had nothing except speed and knowledge of the area. You won by staying alive long enough to kill everyone who came after you. Fourth was silence, no celebrating, no bragging, no gathering where someone could throw a grenade through the window. Men who talked too much got their throats cut by their own people because loose lips got everyone killed. Fifth was discipline: do not steal, do not hurt anyone not part of the war. Dutch's men terrorized everyone, which meant everyone hated them. If Bumpy's crew acted the same, they would lose that advantage, become just another gang the neighborhood wanted gone. Sixth was unpredictability: never follow patterns, never hit the same type of target twice. Patterns got you killed because patterns let your enemy prepare, set traps, be waiting when you thought you had surprise. Seventh was hardest: keep people you care about separate from the war, do not let them become targets or leverage. Which meant Helen could not know details, could not know names or timing. If she knew, she could be forced to tell. If she could be forced, she became weakness. And weakness got you killed in an alley while you begged for mercy that never came. 3 days later, one of Dutch's collectors was found in an alley off 135th Street with his throat open so wide you could see spine through the wound. His money was still in his pockets, not robbery, a message. Dutch Schultz's men were not safe in Harlem. 2 days after that, another got jumped leaving a bar, 3 men with tire irons, swinging for knees first to drop him, then for the head once he was down. They left him breathing barely, skull cracked, jaw broken, right eye socket shattered. The men vanished like ghosts. When police asked questions, nobody had seen anything. Helen kept coming to Harlem through all this, kept trying to write stories Vanity Fair would never print. She submitted a piece about police brutality, about cops beating men for walking on the wrong side of the street, about women dragged into alleys and violated while their husbands got arrested on fake charges. The piece was factual, sourced, documented. It was rejected within 2 hours, too controversial, too likely to upset readers. Bumpy found her in a diner that night staring at cold coffee. He sat without asking. "They killed it," Helen said. "It was too political." "They are afraid," Bumpy said, "not of you, of what happens if people like you start telling truth. Truth makes people ask questions. Questions make people angry. Angry people threaten people in charge. So I should stop trying. Try harder, keep writing, keep submitting. Eventually someone will be brave enough or desperate enough to print it, and when they do, you will have started something that cannot be stopped." Outside, the war continued. Men moved through shadows with weapons, alliances shifted, people died in ways that would never make headlines. And Helen understood she was watching the collision of worlds that were never supposed to touch. Watching something that would end badly for everyone but had to happen anyway because some wars cannot be avoided, only survived. Helen knocked on the apartment door at 10:30 Wednesday night. No answer. She knocked harder. The door opened 6 inches, and a young man with eyes that had seen too much violence looked out. "Bumpy is hurt," he said, not asking who she was, just stating fact. Helen pushed past him. The smell hit first. Copper and sweat and whiskey being used to clean wounds because real medical supplies were not available to people hurt doing things that could not be reported without police involvement. Bumpy was on a couch, shirt off, torso wrapped in bandages soaking through with red. His face was swollen on the left side, eye sealed shut, cheekbone probably cracked from how the skin had turned purple and yellow and split in a line that would scar. She knelt beside him and touched his shoulder gently. His right eye opened. He looked at her without surprise. "You should not be here," Bumpy said, voice rough and damaged. "Dutch knows I am hurt. His men will come back to finish it. Anyone here when they arrive will not leave." "Then we will handle that when it happens," Helen said. She turned to the young man. "I need clean bandages, boiled water, whatever medical supplies exist here, and someone watching the street." The young man looked at Bumpy for confirmation. Should he take orders from this white woman? Bumpy nodded once. The young man left. Helen unwrapped bandages carefully, trying not to look at knife wounds crossing his ribs like someone had been carving their initials, trying not to think how close those cuts came to vital organs. She cleaned wounds with whiskey, which made Bumpy's jaw clench but produced no scream. She wrapped fresh bandages tighter, tight enough to slow the bleeding that had not quite stopped. She gave him water and watched him struggle to swallow, watched him fight to stay conscious even though his body screamed for him to pass out. 4 hours passed, Helen replacing bandages when they soaked through, giving water when he could take it, talking quietly about nothing just so he could hear a voice not telling him he was dying. At 3:00 in the morning, Bumpy spoke again, voice stronger. "You need to leave before sun comes up, before someone sees you and tells Dutch that Bumpy Johnson has a white woman visiting, and Dutch decides you are the leverage he needs." "I am not leaving," Helen said. The words came out harder than intended, absolute. "I am staying until I know you will not die from these wounds. After that, I will decide based on what I want, not what you think is best for me." Bumpy stared at her with his one working eye. Something passed between them, recognition, 2 people who refused to be controlled seeing each other clearly, understanding that neither would bend or break or accept being told who they were allowed to care about. "You do not care about being safe," Bumpy said, statement not question. "No," Helen answered. "I care about being free. Freedom means I choose my own risks, I choose who matters to me, I choose where I go and who I sit with while they bleed and whether I leave when told. Bernard thinks he can buy my choices. You think you can protect me by pushing me away. You are both wrong. I belong to myself. Right now I choose to be here." Bumpy closed his eye. When he opened it again, there was something different. Something that might have been respect or the beginning of understanding that Helen Carlyle was not going to be saved from anything because she did not want saving. Sun came up, Helen was still there. Dutch's men did not come. Bumpy survived the night and the next day and the day after. The wounds healed slowly, leaving scars he would carry for life as proof he had been close enough to dying to feel its breath and had chosen to keep living anyway. Bernard Whitfield sat in his study looking at the report the private detective delivered that morning. 3 pages documenting everywhere Helen had gone for 2 weeks, every taxi, every address, every person she talked to. And there on page 2 was information Bernard paid $1,000 to get but wished he had never learned. Helen had visited an apartment in Harlem, had stayed from 10:30 night until 8 morning, had been seen leaving with clothing that had red stains from someone bleeding heavily. Bernard read the report 3 times. Then he threw all 3 pages into the fireplace and watched them turn to ash. He did not destroy it because it was false. He destroyed it because it was true. Because seeing truth written down made it real. Because now he had to admit Helen was not visiting Harlem for stories, she was visiting for Bumpy Johnson, was spending nights with him, was taking care of him when hurt, was choosing him over everything Bernard offered. The rage that came was cold and calculating, the rage of a man who had destroyed people who opposed him. Bernard poured scotch and stood at the window, understanding he was about to do something that would either bring Helen back or lose her forever. No middle ground, no compromise. He picked up the telephone, dialed a number, waited. I need surveillance on someone, continuous, every movement, every conversation, every person they interact with. I want photographs, clear ones that can be used if necessary. The voice asked who the target was. Bernard gave Bumpy Johnson's name and address. The voice asked the purpose. Bernard paused because saying it out loud would make it official, would set in motion events that could not be undone. I need to know his weaknesses, what he cares about, and when I know that, I am going to take it away from him the way he is taking something from me. He hung up, sat down, finished his scotch. In that moment, Bernard Whitfield became something he had never been before, not a businessman protecting interests. A man so consumed by need to possess something he could not buy that he was willing to destroy it rather than let someone else have it. 3 nights later, Bernard did something he had not done in 20 years. He followed Helen himself. His driver took him through Midtown, up through Upper West, across into Harlem where buildings got shorter and streets got darker. The taxi Helen rode stopped in front of a tenement on 131st Street that should have been condemned years ago. Bernard watched Helen disappear into the building. He sat for 10 minutes trying to decide if he should follow, should confront her, should see for himself what made her choose this over everything he offered. Finally, he stepped onto the street. 2 young men on the corner turned to look at him, eyes measuring him like wolves measure prey. One spoke, voice flat and cold. This is not your neighborhood, old man, you do not belong here. Get back in your car and leave before you find out what happens to people who wander into places they have no business being. Bernard wanted to argue, wanted to explain who he was, that he could have them arrested with a phone call. But looking at their faces, at the absolute lack of fear, he understood none of that mattered here. His money was worthless in this place. His power did not extend beyond neighborhoods where people cared about bank accounts. Here, the only thing that mattered was whether you were willing to fight and die. He got back in the car, told his driver to leave. But in his head, over and over, he heard those words like a verdict. This is not your neighborhood, you do not belong here. For the first time in decades, Bernard Whitfield felt poor. Not lacking money, lacking access to the one place that mattered, the one door his money could not open. That poverty, that exclusion, that proof there were things he could not control or purchase, it ate at him worse than any financial loss. He had lost deals before, but never like this. Never been made to feel his wealth meant nothing when measured against a woman's choice to sit in a Harlem apartment with a man who had nothing except willingness to stand when told to kneel. The war was no longer theoretical, the war was personal. And Bernard had just decided that if he could not have Helen, he would make sure Bumpy Johnson lost everything that mattered to him, even if that meant burning down Harlem itself to prove the point. Bernard Whitfield understood that forcing Helen to choose would only make her leave faster, would only prove what she already believed about him, that he saw her as property to be managed rather than a person to be respected. So he changed tactics. If he could not control Helen directly, he would remove the obstacle that made her choose against him. He would buy Bumpy Johnson the way he bought everything else that stood in his way, would make an offer so large that refusing it would be insanity, would prove that every man had a price if you just found the right number. The lawyer he sent was named Marcus Webb, a man who specialized in transactions that required privacy, who had arranged deals for Bernard that involved politicians and criminals and sometimes both at the same time. Webb found Bumpy at a movie theater on 145th Street on a Thursday afternoon. Sitting alone in the back row watching a film he was not paying attention to because he was watching the exits and the other patrons and making sure nobody was positioning themselves to put a bullet in his head while the screen flickered and the music played. Webb sat down 2 seats away and spoke without looking at Bumpy, keeping his voice low enough that nobody else could hear but loud enough that there was no mistaking what was being said. "Mr. Whitfield would like to make you an offer. $50,000 cash, unmarked bills, no strings attached except one. You stop seeing Helen Carlisle, you tell her it is over, you make her believe you do not want her around anymore. You do this and the money is yours to keep, to spend, to invest however you see fit." Bumpy kept watching the screen, did not turn to look at the lawyer, did not react at all for 10 seconds that felt longer than they were. "Tell Mr. Whitfield that Helen is not for sale. Tell him I am not for sale. Tell him to go back to his penthouse and his senators and his world where everything can be purchased because that world does not include her anymore." Webb shifted in his seat. He had been prepared for negotiation, for counter-offers, for the dance that happened when two sides wanted different things but were willing to compromise. He had not been prepared for outright rejection, for a response that left no room for further discussion. "Mr. Whitfield is prepared to go higher, $100,000. That is more money than you will see in your lifetime doing what you do. That is enough to leave Harlem, to start over somewhere else, to live like a human being instead of like an animal waiting for the next person who wants you dead." Bumpy turned his head slowly and looked at Webb directly for the first time. His eyes were flat and empty, the eyes of someone who had killed enough people that one more would not make any difference to how he slept at night. "You go back to your boss and you tell him something. You tell him he did not lose Helen because of me. He lost her because he thought everything had a price. He looked at a human being and saw a transaction. He looked at a woman and saw property. That is why she left, not because I offered her something better, because he never offered her anything except a cage made of diamonds." Webb stood up, tried one more time because Bernard had authorized him to go as high as necessary to make this problem disappear. $150,000, final offer. You take it and walk away or you refuse it and Mr. Whitfield will make your life so difficult that you will wish you had taken the money when it was offered. Bumpy smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had been threatened by people far more dangerous than a billionaire who thought money solved everything. "He can try, but money does not break kneecaps. Money does not cut throats. Money does not survive in Harlem when everyone knows you are the one who brought hell down on the neighborhood. Tell your boss that if he wants me gone, he will have to do better than waving cash around like it means something to people who have learned to live without it." Webb left the theater and reported back to Bernard that evening. Bernard listened to the entire conversation, heard his offer rejected 3 times, heard himself described as someone who saw people as transactions, and felt something inside him crack. Not break, crack. The kind of damage that does not show on the surface but spreads through everything underneath until the whole structure is weakened. 48 hours before the ultimatum, Bernard invited Helen to dinner at his penthouse. Private dinner, no guests, no staff after the food was served, just the two of them in a silence that hung between them like smoke from a fire that was still burning somewhere out of sight. The wine was Chateau Margaux 1900, one of the finest bottles in his collection, saved for occasions that mattered. The food was prepared by a chef who normally cooked for European royalty. Everything was perfect except the two people sitting at the table. Bernard waited until they had finished eating before he spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent decades learning to hide emotion behind logic and reason. I know about Harlem, I know about him, I want to understand why. I want to know what I failed to provide that made you choose that over this. Helen set down her wine glass carefully, the way you handle something fragile that might shatter if you are not gentle. She looked at Bernard across the table and saw him clearly for the first time in months. Saw past the money and the power and the carefully constructed image. Saw the man underneath who was terrified of losing control. You never asked what I wanted, Bernard. You decided what I should want and then provided it and expected gratitude. You never asked if I wanted the penthouse or the estate or the dinners with senators. You assumed. And when I started going to Harlem, when I started spending time with people you did not approve of, you did not ask why. You just decided it was wrong and tried to stop it. Bernard's jaw tightened. His hands remained flat on the table, but the tendons in his wrist stood out like cables under tension. I gave you everything. I opened doors that are closed to everyone else. I introduced you to people who control this country. I provided safety and comfort and a life that most people can only dream about. What more could you possibly want? To be seen, Helen said. The words came out quiet but absolute. To be asked what I think instead of being told what I should think. To make choices that are mine instead of choices that fit into your plan. You admired me the way people admire paintings in museums. Beautiful, expensive, something to own and display. But you never respected me as a person who might want something different than what you decided I should have. The silence that followed was worse than shouting would have been. Bernard poured himself more wine and drank half the glass before speaking again. When he did, his voice had changed, had an edge to it that Helen had never heard before, an edge that sounded like something breaking. He is black, Helen. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what people will say, what it will do to your career, what it will do to everything you have built? Helen stood up slowly. She folded her napkin and placed it on the table with the kind of precision that comes from wanting to be very careful about what you do next because the alternative is violence. There it is, the real reason, not that he is dangerous, not that he is a criminal, not any of the things you could have said that might have been legitimate concerns, just that he is black, just that you cannot stand the idea that I chose someone you consider beneath you, someone your money and your power and your connections cannot intimidate or buy or control. She walked toward the door. Bernard stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, loud in the quiet apartment. If you leave now, if you choose him over me, I will make sure he pays for it. I will call every contact I have in the police department. I will have him arrested. I will make sure he ends up in prison or dead in an alley. I will use everything I have to remove him from the equation. And then you will understand that choices have consequences. Helen stopped at the door, turned back to look at him one last time. Her voice when she spoke was not angry or sad or any of the emotions Bernard expected. It was simply tired. The voice of someone who had finally stopped trying to make something work that was broken from the beginning. Bernard, you never had me, not really. You had someone who was willing to see if what you offered was real, but it was never real. It was always a transaction, always conditional, always about control. So go ahead and do whatever you think you need to do, call your contacts, make your threats, destroy him if you can, but understand this. Even if he is gone tomorrow, I will still never come back to you. Because what you are showing me right now is what you always were underneath all the expensive gifts and the careful words. You are someone who thinks love can be purchased and people can be owned. And I would rather be alone for the rest of my life than be owned by anyone. She walked out. The door closed behind her with a sound that was final as a gunshot. Bernard stood in his penthouse, surrounded by everything he had accumulated over a lifetime of winning, and understood that none of it mattered. That he had just lost the only thing he actually wanted, and that trying to force someone to stay was the surest way to make them leave forever. The ultimatum had failed before it was even delivered. The threats were empty because even if he destroyed Bumpy Johnson, even if he used every ounce of power he possessed to remove the obstacle, Helen would still be gone. And that truth, that absolute proof that his money could not buy what mattered most, was more painful than any financial loss he had ever suffered. This was how power learned its limits, through the quiet departure of someone who refused to be controlled, through the understanding that some things could not be taken or bought or forced, that freedom was the one currency more valuable than wealth. And that a person who chose to leave could not be kept no matter how much you were willing to pay to keep them. Bernard had built an empire by understanding that everything had a price. Helen had just taught him that he was wrong. Dutch Schultz died in October 1935, shot in a Newark restaurant by men who walked in and fired without warning. The bullets opened his abdomen and left him breathing long enough to reach a hospital where he died 22 hours later, rambling words no one understood. His death ended the Harlem War. Stephanie St. Clair kept the numbers racket. Bumpy Johnson remained her enforcer, the man who survived and carried scars that marked him until his final breath. Helen left when the war ended, not with drama. She simply stopped coming to Harlem as often, stopped being there when he needed someone. The intensity that pulled them together, the danger and urgency, evaporated when Dutch died and streets went quiet. She married a professor years later, lived into her 80s, wrote a memoir mentioning Bumpy twice, both times carefully. But people who knew her said when his name came up, something changed in her eyes before she remembered to hide it. Bernard Whitfield lived to 93, died in his penthouse surrounded by everything he had accumulated. His obituary called him a titan, a kingmaker. It did not mention Helen, did not mention the destroyed photograph or rejected offer. People who knew Bernard said he carried bitterness until the end, revealed in how he spoke about loyalty, how he reacted when anyone suggested money could not buy happiness. He never married, never had children, died alone except for paid staff. He won every business battle, lost the only human one that mattered. Bumpy stayed in Harlem, got arrested repeatedly over 3 decades, spent years in prison, got out, went back to the streets because streets were all he knew. Became a legend people whispered about. Died in 1968, collapsed on a corner, heart finally stopping after decades of violence. Died in the neighborhood he fought for, surrounded by people who knew his name. The new order after Dutch was not peace, just different violence, same poverty making people desperate. Harlem remained Harlem, faces changed, names changed, reality stayed the same, people without power carving dignity in a world designed to crush them. The lesson was simple. Real power does not come from fear, it comes from respect. If you buy someone's heart, threaten them to stay, destroy everyone around them to make yourself the only option, that is not love, that is transaction, contract enforced through force. Those contracts end with one person leaving and the other standing alone wondering why power was not enough. Bernard could buy Wall Street seats, could call the most powerful people, could arrange the world so everyone needed his permission, but he could not buy being seen as human instead of property. That was why money won everything except truth. Truth that people cannot be owned. Truth that freedom is more valuable than comfort. Truth that a woman who chooses to leave cannot be kept regardless of price. A photograph that should not exist, 3 people in a ballroom. A billionaire who thought money purchased love. A woman who refused purchase. A man from Harlem who understood some things were worth more than survival. The war, the failed ultimatum, the departure that could not be prevented. The lesson that remains, power has limits and money cannot buy what matters most. And the only thing more expensive than losing someone is realizing you never had them at all. This story is shared for historical insight and personal reflection, not to promote violence or illegal behavior. Thank you for watching until the end. These stories take weeks of research and writing to create. If this resonated with you, if you see the lesson Bumpy Johnson was teaching about accountability and education over violence, hit that subscribe button. Help us reach 1 million subscribers so we can keep telling stories that matter. Stories about power used wisely. Stories about consequences faced honestly. Stories about men who chose to change systems instead of just destroying enemies. The next video drops soon. Until then, remember, real power is not what you can destroy, it is what you choose to build.